producing Shakespeare today, as I put in my emails to these folks, to put it unnecessarily combatively and provocatively, why are we still producing plays by a 400-year dead European white man at a time when we are trying to diversify the plays that we do and reach modern audiences and make new plays? Why are we still doing Shakespeare? Also, let me make clear, I have a PhD in Shakespeare. I do think Shakespeare has value, but being provocative is fun sometimes. So yes, please introduce yourselves, including sort of what your history with Shakespeare and his work might be.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Ann Daniels. I'm the Director of Programming for the Folger Shakespeare Library. I'm also the Artistic Director for Folger Theatre. My history with Shakespeare started with an episode of DuckTales called Much Ado About Macduck. So that's where we began. And I did look it up because I could remember this episode. But I will say that I think was the first time I really understood that was like a person, like there's somebody out there who does this stuff. And then they created a whole really fun episode that made me, I think, a little more curious about Shakespeare. Aside from, Disney cartoon, my real encounters with Shakespeare then, of course, came through being an actor, and then from being an actor into working with Shakespeare in communities. Before that, with education, communities, and working at the Old Globe in San Diego. Took me to the Public Theater in New York, touring the mobile unit around New York City there. I was doing similar touring around San Diego County before that. Most of that being Shakespeare as well. And now I'm at the Folger. So you got my history, at least the important bits.
Hi, I'm Craig Wallace, and wow. So I went to Howard University, and I think it was Michael Kahn, who was previously artistic director of Shakespeare Theatre. He came and he wanted some people of color on stage. So they sent 3 of us from Howard over to be on stage at Shakespeare Theatre. At the time, Howard didn't teach Shakespeare, so I couldn't even read a Shakespeare play. But I got on stage with all these incredible people, many of whom you know, Ed Jarrow, Emery Battis, Ted Frank Reithausen, Floyd King. And I knew I wanted to do it. I was just so fascinated by it. So I went away to graduate school, and then I ended up back at the Shakespeare Theatre, which I eventually joined the company, and that's it. I mean, I just knew that I wanted to do it, and I couldn't do it. And I went to grad school and came back, and it's interesting because now we do teach Shakespeare at Howard. Actually, I teach it, which is great. And I've got 8 left to complete the canon.
Hi, I'm Drew Lichtenberg. I am the resident dramaturg at the Shakespeare Theatre Company. And I started at STC in 2011. So I think I've worked on 20 of the plays, but not as many as you have, Craig, as my friend Craig here. And I don't know if it's been announced, but Craig is going to be on our stages in February in King Lear.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
And Gloucester, King Lear. Yeah, I'm like breaking some news here. Craig joining us again in his illustrious Shakespearean career. My history with Shakespeare, I think, starts in junior high school. It's a little bit of a funny story because I went to a public high school in Western Massachusetts with a strong history of producing Shakespeare. And my brother tried out for the play, for Romeo and Juliet. And he got cast as Peter, the nurse's assistant. And I did not try out. I thought Shakespeare was, fine, whatever. And I was just following my brother to rehearsal one day when the actor playing Tybalt, who had been cast as Tybalt, wanted to be cast as Romeo because he had a relationship with, or an ex-relationship with the actress playing Juliet.
Isn't that always the way?
And he was cast as Tybalt, said, I quit. And then, Drew, can you play? Can you speak? Can you play? So I got the better part. I got cast as Tybalt, and my brother was very, very mad at me. The rest was history.
Beautiful. Craig, you sort of actually gestured at this. I mean, I think each of you in different ways, but I'd love to hear from each of you, why you've chosen to make Shakespeare such a large part of your career. And I think, Craig, in your sort of origin story, this notion of articulating that sense of you needed to do this thing. Feels like a right place to start with that question. Like, why did you need to do it in that first exposure?
Well, first of all, because I couldn't do it. Also, at the time, part of the being an intern was working with members of the company on monologues and things like that. And I remember I did The 7 Ages of Man for an actor who's now a dear friend of mine. But at the time, she went, stop. It's not your fault. You don't understand what you're saying. And anybody who knows me knows that if you want me to figure out something, tell me. I can't do it. I just watched all of these people with this powerful language and these powerful stories, and I just wanted to be a part of it. And I thought that if I could understand it, then I could play it. So that's really what part of it was personal. Part of it was I'll show you.
Yeah.
But part of it was also watching these incredible people speaking this incredible language.
Karen, Andrew, I think this question of since that beginning, since watching DuckTales, since high school, why does it continue to be such a significant part?
I mean, honestly, I have a kind of a similar story. I mean, I got my master's degree in musical theater, so not Shakespeare. I got my undergraduate degree in art history, so not theater. So when I was in the middle of my graduate program, you have to do your thesis. And I'd never really, my acting classes had been inconsistent. In my mind, I think because I had grown up with so much sort of like Shakespeare in school and 7 Ages of Man, that's what's in the episode of Much Ado About Macduff. That's how it concludes. And, like all of these kind of different exposures, I thought in order to be a good actor, I needed to be able to act Shakespeare. So I, in the middle of my grad career, went to to BADA, to the British American Drama Academy. When all of my other cohort, members were going to do summer stock, I was like, I'm going to Oxford now, and I'm going to study some Shakespeare, right? So that was me, that was them. I came back after that, had an amazing experience, first of all. But ended up, through that process, really seeing some distinctive parallels between the musicals and Shakespeare, and ended up writing my thesis on Shakespeare, essentially, as like sort of a model in a relationship to the musical theater book. And so I guess from that point forward, that's just kind of what ended up happening. But I think our culture feeds it to us. They tell us in order to be smarter, noticed, whatever, embedded in this idea that everybody must learn some Shakespeare is that idea.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some good about that, there's a lot of bad about it. And so then as I got older and I was doing work, particularly with communities, we have a tendency to be like, we must take Shakespeare out to the world. And I'm like, why? Other people have their own cultures, they have their own art forms, they have their own artists that we've just not valued in our cultural capital of the Shakespeare land. And so I think that I started to really engage with people and start asking them about Shakespeare. So instead of making assumptions about why he's important or what I thought they might get out of it, I just started talking to people and learning about that history, right? Using it as an oppressive tool versus a tool of, I think, liberation. And I think what I heard in part of what you said is that it could be a tool of liberation for me as an individual. And that's the part that I cling to in the work that I do, right? Which is, I found a kind of liberation in the language, in the stories, in the ability to play, honestly, that I don't find in other things, right? And I think that that's, for me, what the real connection is.
Yes, it's so interesting to hear Karen Ann and Craig, both of you talking and recognizing things that are different and also things that are, I think, the same. When I went to graduate school, I went to Yale, which specializes, it's the only drama school that has every discipline, right? But I got there at a very fraught time for new play dramaturgy. They had just fired the previous chair of new play, of playwriting, and the dramaturgs, before I got there, had all kind of beaten up on the playwrights. So this playwright named Richard Nelson came in and kind of instituted a new policy that dramaturgs were not allowed to work on new plays. So Terrell McCraney was there, who's currently, the chair of playwriting, worked on August Wilson's play. I worked on his play in the Red and Brown Water, but I was not allowed to call myself a dramaturg. So Shakespeare became this kind of safe haven. It was a place where I could actually work and use all of my skills. It was a place of liberation, empowerment. It was also a kind of intimidating thing, a mountain that I felt like I had to scale, right? You mentioned the 8 plays you have left to do. I think everyone who loves Shakespeare has that running list of how many plays they've seen or how many plays they've worked on. And my second year, I worked on Shakespeare in the Park at the Public, and the director Moises Kaufman, and this was a few years after he had written the Laramie Project, and he's an amazing documentary theater maker, amazing director. He's also a Latinx theater maker, and he wanted to do the Scottish play. He wanted to bring himself to this work, and also to have this work transform him. So I think Shakespeare can often be a kind of double-edged sword. It can be a thing that is used to reificate an elitist power structure, but you also have people coming from different backgrounds who want to prove that they can scale that mountain and be part of that, be part of a new structure, new Shakespeare in that way.
That's actually is I think perfect segue to the next question I had. As I just said before, at a time when so many theaters, in this room, are really very thoughtfully and deliberately trying to invite both artists and audiences that have not been traditionally included. Shakespeare feels, right, like Shakespeare has that cultural capital. He is sort of the pinnacle of European and American elitism in some way. I think he's also very much an artist of the people, but he is both. And so, why are we still doing Shakespeare? What's the argument for him?
I don't know if I have a direct answer. I will say what is interesting about this time that we're in is that we have to be able to hold the complexity. We have to hold all the things. So it's not about cancellation. It is about letting go, I think, of some ideas that we've been taught about why he matters or who he is to people or who he should be, and taking a step back from it and allowing people to engage with him on their own terms instead of being told he's the best. If that you have to climb the Shakespeare ladder, right? Like that's not a thing. I think he's really valuable, like the themes, the ideas, the fun we can have, the release we get from participating in it. And I think when we move those ideas and those obstacles that are very elitist, some of them are racist, right? Like we just allow people to just have some fun and engage with it from where they are in that moment on that day. I think that's the case for why he gets to stay.
Yeah.
But it's us. We have to relax our grip on him. That's kind of how I feel about it.
I would certainly agree with that. I mean, I tried to mostly ask questions, but I will offer something just on that point. I mean, the Tempest that we are currently running is, I think, a really fascinating example of this in terms of like those responses. I think for the most part, audiences have been enjoying it. I hope you all enjoy it when you see it. But we've had a couple of folks who, even though I don't think there's actually much that radical in it, I think there are some people who have a hard time letting go. And I have had a couple of conversations with audience members that that are not even sort of like, this isn't how I want it to be done, but almost feeling anger is maybe a little strong.
Yeah.
But there is a clear sense that there is something that they are not able to let go of, and that this is not what they want it to be. Yeah.
And also, I think I have a really good friend of mine when I was working at the Old Globe, and we're about this same age and what at the time we were probably like our early mid-30s or whatever, right? And I invited her to come in to see the Scottish play, which I like to call Mac Daddy B. That's my name for it, but Mac Daddy B. So I brought her to see this play, and it was I'm trying to remember what's his name, Brian. I can't remember this director's name right now. Anyways, he's really well known in New York in particular, and I believe he taught at Columbia, but I can't remember his name. Anyways, he did this very, very sort of futuristic version of it. And as she came, she sat, we watched the play, and I was like, oh, wasn't the set cool? And wasn't the, my little nerdy theater stuff, I was all into it. And then we walked out, and she was like, yeah, it's not what I was expecting to see. And I'm thinking, but it's modern, it's kind of young, it's kind of hip, it's got all the things that we think a Shakespeare play should have to reach a wider audience or a younger audience or whatever, right? And she was like, yeah, I just was looking for the history. And I was like, so you were looking for pumpkin pants and a coffee filter collar? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, you realize that's just the clothes they wore back then, right? And she was like, no. And I was like, yeah. So it's not just like, it's not just those of us that have been like, this is our guy forever. Like we've taught people that to expect a thing. You know what I mean? So it's we just have to let it go a little bit, let it breathe, let it find its way again. And also I think find renewed relevance in our lives today, because I think that's the really important part of Shakespeare, right? When we talk about, people like to say, oh, he's universal, right? The universality, I think, comes from just exactly that, allowing me to bring my experiences into the room and find my deep connection and parallels to the story, to the characters, to the, and all of that. So I don't need anybody to tell me how to feel, right? When Romeo and Juliet miss each other at the end, like nobody needs to tell me what that should feel like, because I have my own well of experiences. We forget that audiences are actually responsible for 50% of the imagination that goes into watching a play. So I think that's some of the things I think about it.
Oh, Craig's looking at me. The Tempest is an interesting example, and I saw this production on Friday thanks to my friend Naysan here, getting me tickets. Thank you so much. It was a packed house, super entertaining production, very funny, very inventive. But The Tempest is a play that, again, I talked about the double-edged sword, right? It's a play that was inspired by a real-life account of a shipwreck of settlers heading to the Jamestown colony who ended up on a mysterious island in Bermuda. It mentions Tunis and Algiers. It's a play kind of about imperialism and colonialism and slavery. And the character of Caliban, it's an anagram of cannibal, right? And Shakespeare was influenced by Montaigne. And this production of The Tempest, it doesn't really go into that. It's not that version of The Tempest that you're seeing. When we did The Tempest at STC in 2013 or 14, the director wanted to do a kind of modern day or contemporary version of The Tempest, but we had an actor named Clifton Duncan playing Caliban, extraordinary Juilliard-trained actor, 6'5", incredibly handsome, and he came to me and said, Drew, I really want you to find research for me about slavery. I want to play Caliban as a slave, and I want it to be unambiguous. And this was very unsettling to the white director of the production, So the actor playing Caliban was in his production of The Tempest. He was wrestling with something that was important for him to wrestle with. And it was a kind of a collaboration, right, between the whole company of trying to find the right way of telling that story, right? The Tempest is a play that contains all these different stories. It's also a play about magic, and that's what's emphasized in Aaron Posner's production. So often people will bring their own preconceptions to Shakespeare's plays, and like you're saying, Karen, and they are a test of the audience. They're a test of who we are and how we express our own selves through Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare he's always changing, he's always evolving in conversation with the society that is surrounding him.
I'm not without my purist notions.
All right.
but I'm always willing to, but it's interesting because we're having a discussion at Howard whether or not we should be teaching Shakespeare, whether we should be, teaching some other playwrights, so some Afrocentric playwrights, and that's an ongoing conversation. But we're the reason why we shouldn't do Shakespeare, because 9 times out of 10 we're not doing it right. It's the language. It's the language. If we get people, one of the joys of my life as a teacher is teaching these young African Americans and having them do the light bulb when they do Mac Daddy, or when they do Romeo, or when they do Angelo, or when they do the light bulb. And then suddenly it's alive. And that's a joy of my life, because back to my story, it looked like blabbity blah to me. And in high school, we took the classes in high school, but quite frankly, in high school, the kids that got it were the kids that got it. And the kids that didn't, you don't understand. So I truly believe that it lies in the language. The language, we illuminate the language. How many times have people come up to me and said, I understood that. They're amazed that they understood the show, because their expectation is to hear blobbity, blobbity, blah, blah, blah. I tell my students about those long speeches, you have to keep them alive, or people will go, oh, he's mad. And they won't listen to anything you say until the next beat. It's about keeping that language alive. And if we keep the language alive, then we can explore theme and concept and all of that stuff. The other thing I'm really interested in, and maybe I'm jumping
Go for it.
but this idea of iambic pentameter. What happens to an African who doesn't speak iambic pentameter? How do we marry their understanding of poetry with the needs of Shakespeare? Suddenly now, it's not wrong for that person of African descent to take that speech and make it their own. Because that was a big thing back in the 90s. You can't say it like that. You can't say it like. Now, of course, 9 times out of 10, Shakespeare's helping you out there with the pentameter. It's just the way he wrote, it's the way he wrote his verse. But that's not to say that we can't do, and that's the reason I say it's our fault, because we need more of the dramaturg. Another thing that we were talking about when you asked me to do this, I realized that, I would always play the bad guy. I was Pompey. I was Jack Cade. I was Poins. Always these, low-born, clever, cool roles. And we never discussed what does that mean in our world. To have Pompey be played by a black man, a threat to the triumvirate. We never even discussed it. And so that's where just the discussion of it can illuminate the play in such a way that you all out there can go, wow, that's deep. That's interesting. So we have to work harder. Directors, dramaturgs, actors who take the roles. I took all the roles. I didn't say, well, wait a minute. I'm not playing that. I may say it now, but when I was young, I was happy to have it. But we can keep, because the stories are just, the violence is more violent than violent. The love is more love than love. I tell my kids all the time, Shakespeare's not about kings and queens. These people lust, they love, they're funny. They're people that just happen to have a king before their name. But they're all human beings, and finding that humanness in the play is why it's endured and why it can endure with different genders, with different people of color. It can endure, but we've got to do more of that work, I think. Sorry.
Sure, you seem like you had.
Well, no, just hearing you talk, Craig, about the light bulb going off, it reminds me of when I was at Yale and was working on a production of Richard III. And one of my classmates, Brian Tyree Henry, who's now on Atlanta and a big movie star now, he was just kind of not giving a great performance. He was just kind of withdrawn. And I remember talking to the director about like, what's going on with Brian? You know, he's electrifying when he's in Terrell McCraney's plays. Why does he not seem to be into being in a Shakespeare play? And we talked to him, and we realized that his character is called a slave in that play as a term of insult, right? And obviously Shakespeare's writing for he's writing for a monolithically white society that would have maybe diplomats from Morocco, right, visit that would inspire Othello or something. But it was a conversation with him about, yes, Shakespeare's coming out of a world in which, first of all, the Middle Ages, they didn't practice slavery. Slavery is a modern invention, capitalism, right? And people use this term to dehumanize others in his plays. Just like they use villain. Villain is a reference to somebody who's been disinherited, right? Somebody who has no land. And at some point in our conversation, the light bulb went off in Brian's mind. And he thought, oh, I can do this. This is something that I can have ownership of. And he was amazing in the show. And that was, it was a small moment, the kind of moment you need to solve in order to have a successful production, but it was also an important conversation to have.
So I think both your responses are already sort of moving the survey, but the sort of final big question I had was this notion of because I've really been thinking about audiences, but I think this also raises the point that to what degree do we, whether it is moving Shakespeare to us or moving us to Shakespeare, how do we bridge that gap? And I think that sort of I've really been thinking about this as audiences, but I think to both of your points that us as artists as well, that there is a gap between the artists, the contemporary theater artists and Shakespeare as well. And so do we continue doing Shakespearean original practices, or do we need to change? Do we need to educate how do we make these two things bring them into the same space?
I'm thinking.
This is the work.
Well, I should also mention that STC currently has a production of Much Ado About Nothing on stage,
Yes.
which you should all go see. Yes, thank you. Which is
It's
kind of
fantastic. And you've extended it.
We have extended it. I don't know if it's
very good
quite as smash hit as The Tempest is, but it's a very popular show.
Yeah.
It's doing very well.
And it's actually it feels like a great example. So yeah.
And it feels like it's in conversation with Aaron's production of The Tempest because we've set the play. Sorry, Craig, your dearest heart will hear this. We've set the play in the Washington, D.C. newsroom. So it opens with a cameo from Wolf Blitzer departing as the co-anchor and Benedict joining as the co-anchor opposite Beatrice. So they have this kind of broadcast news type relationship with one another. And we, Simon Godwin, the director, whose wife, by the way, I think just had a baby today. Which is why I'm here and not Simon. When he got here, he said, Drew, what is a Washington, D.C. story that we can tell and what to do about nothing? He was really interested in finding a way of unleashing the play, right? Of taking all these ideas that are bound up in the play and making them feel relevant and new. Because if you look at Much Ado About Nothing, well, it's the first romantic comedy, really, kind of. It's the progenitor of this whole form. And you have movies like His Girl Friday and broadcast news, which are kind of set in this media world. But it's also a play about people playing love games. Like the currency of the world is rumor and gossip and scurrilous gossip and reputation damaging, destroying gossip. And Claudio acting in a pretty terrible way to Hero, his fiance, based on hearsay. It's actually a play about men behaving badly, right? It's a play about Me Too, right? Accusations, again, that are weaponized against women. And that also is something that has happened in the media world in recent years. And I think I can share with you, the original cameo was going to be Chris Matthews before he had to step down from his job at CNBC because of a scandal. So it was a case of life imitating art in a weird way. So again, we're not necessarily changing Much Ado About Nothing. We're finding a contemporary framework for the play to tell its story that maybe sadly is still something that we're dealing with, which is these inequalities between men and women, the way women's sexuality can be weaponized and used against them. I mean, Shakespeare is, as he is with The Tempest, he's one of the first people sometimes who tells these stories that are sadly stories that we're still telling ourselves about our society. So he's very useful at times as a way of understanding what human nature is and what we're still wrestling with as human beings.
I mean, I think Shakespeare today could be. I mean, I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it. That's maybe the best way. You know, the way I'm thinking about it is who's always had sort of the keys to the kingdom, and can that kingdom be unlocked for other people by giving the keys over to lots of people to tell the stories from their perspectives, their experiences, their vantage points, to interpret the language from where they sit in the world. And I think to help create those rooms that you're talking about, right, where we can actually honestly look at who's inhabiting a role, who's playing it, and what that context might add to an audience watching it today. And also how do we create a safe space for different kinds of actors of different kinds of identities, particularly when you're coming up against these roles that have been historically played certain ways. So, you know, for me, we're going to be hosting a reading series in January of staged readings of plays, and you know, we're looking at people who are looking at Shakespeare and taking some of the ideas out and being like, let's create a new play that maybe only is isolating certain relationships in the play, so that we can actually kind of put a kind of different kind of lens on that, right? So what are these women? What happens if Ophelia and the Queen and Gertrude actually had a relationship with each other? Because come on, women, we know if we get in a room, we get together, we're going to figure it out a certain way. But because of the men in the room behaving badly, and then I have some feelings. I'm so sorry.
I'll get it.
Thank you. I guess I said the men behaving badly. But because of that, Ophelia dies. Like to think about that, all of the different layers that have happened in that. And so can we talk about what happens when women get together? But use the play, use the circumstances to help illustrate that, right? That's one play. We could talk about historical characters that actually matter to us now through the lens, drawing those parallels. Like, you know, a few years ago when in Park, what was the play they did? What was it, Caesar? But that's Trump. Oh. Right. What they did, that was kind of scandalous. But that's an example. We're looking at a play that's looking at Malcolm X and the life of Malcolm X when he leaves Africa and he goes forward through the lens of Julius Caesar. There's some really interesting, intriguing things to talk about there that are really relevant to our lives today, the things that we're doing. But it gives us a lens and a frame to do that, right? We're also actually looking at what does it mean to do the plays in other languages, right? So we're going to do a bilingual Hamlet, so that we can, again, explore ideas about identity and how we perceive identities through the lens of Hamlet. And I think that, you know, those are the kinds of things that we can now do. We can just say, this belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
This is my culture. I am part of the Western culture that is adopted and capitalized and contributed to the kingdom of Shakespeare. How can I use this today to tell the stories that matter to me and to the people in my community, or to, you know, what you're talking about, like create a frame, right, for larger issues, political, social things that are happening in our world that might be more interesting to some people that I know, or some people that you know, or it might get us all in a room to start thinking about ideas or concepts that we can't seem to find a way to think about outside, right? So that, how do I get in and engage around ideas that are really troubling in our world today? But sometimes when I get in a room and I get with other people, I suddenly remember and recall that we are all human beings and that we can find that common ground, or we can talk about an idea in a different way. So I think Shakespeare is so much of a tool to be utilized and not, you know, and be entertained. So please don't hear me saying I don't like to be entertained. That's not what I'm saying. but I do think that that's a really big way that I'm looking for the kind of Shakespeare that matters to me in my life today.
Can I ask Craig to read something that might also be appropriate?
Sure.
So a couple years ago, we did a production of The Amen Corner by James Baldwin. which actually premiered here in DC at Howard University in 1953. And I can't remember who the chair was of the playwriting or play program there, but he actually didn't like the play because it was written in the dialect of Black Americans in the 50s. And he thought it was embarrassing for Howard University to produce a play that was written in the language that Baldwin knew, which I just think is fascinating. Made me think of what you were saying. But as part of the dramaturgy, I found this essay that Baldwin wrote called "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare." And, I'm a white man, so I don't know if it's right for me to read this. And I knew Craig Wallace was going to be here. So Craig, could I give you my phone?
Given it to me before.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm springing this on you.
Yeah, I'll read it.
Okay, great. Sorry, the type is relatively small.
Every writer in the English language, I should imagine, has at some point hated Shakespeare, has turned away from that monstrous achievement with a kind of sick envy. In my most anti-English days, I condemned him as a chauvinist. This England indeed. And because I felt it so bitterly anomalous that a Black man should be forced to deal with the English language at all, should be forced to assault the English language in order to be able to speak, I condemned him as one of the authors and architects of my oppression. My quarrel with the English language has been that the language reflected none of my experience. But now I began to see the matter in quite another way. If the language was not my own, it might be the fault of the language, but it also might be my fault. Perhaps the language was not my own because I had never attempted to use it, had only learned to imitate it. If this were so, then it might be made to bear the burden of my experience if I could find the stamina to challenge it and me to such a test. Do you want to go on? It's long.
It's really
But that I think
it
is
does illustrate,
yeah.
I think, what some of what we've been talking about.
Just this
Yeah.
maybe just these first couple sentences.
The greatest poet in the English language found his poetry where poetry is found, in the lives of the people. He could have done this only through love, by knowing, which is not the same thing as understanding, that whatever was happening to anyone was happening to him. It is said that his time was easier than ours, but I doubt it. No time can be easy if one is living through it.
Amen.
Thank you.
Man.
Yeah.
I'm sensitive to time because there is some extra pre-show entertainment, and I don't want y'all to miss that in the space. But I think we might have time for an audience question. If somebody has a burning question for our panel, I think we might have time for one. If not, perfect, all right. Please.
Thank you. This has been a very enlightening presentation. For me, the biggest barrier to Shakespeare was, as you say, its strength, the language. That it's very hard even for a well-educated person to wade through the Old English. And I think, and the Folger does that very often, when they modernize the stories, I think it makes it, I would like your reaction to that, why that isn't done more in a way of popularizing.
Well, Shakespeare himself did that. When he wrote Julius Caesar, there's a line, everyone threw their caps in the air. They weren't wearing caps in ancient Rome, they were wearing togas, right? He would often take plays set in ancient England in the case of King Lear or ancient Rome, but people would be wearing modern Elizabethan dress and speaking like modern Elizabethans do. He was updating and modernizing himself.
So what would be the
So what's the
argument?
problem if directors now do the same?
I mean, there's a lot of work out there. To be honest with you, maybe I don't know about locally. I'm real new here, so I was late. I'm sorry, but I honestly, there's a lot of people. Cal Shakes just did Marcus Gardley's Lear, and that's a product of Play On. People are doing versions. I mean, we've always done it. We've always cut it up. We've always played with the stories. We forget to talk about that, but it's true. When you see something that you're like, oh, why is this a 75-minute version? When I know this play is at least 3 hours long, in writing. But we do it. We play with it, and I think it's valid to do it. So I'm just going to say I give you permission to interpret and experience Shakespeare any way that you want. I will say that with the language and in my practice that I feel it always takes about 15 or 20 minutes for you to really click in. When you're talking to somebody who's from a different part of the world and their accent is unfamiliar to you, and sometimes you miss things for a little bit. But then after a while, you get into their cadence, you watch their gestures, you start to feel, the experience that they're bringing to you. It's the same thing when you're listening to the Elizabethan language. And so I always try to remember, when I go into a play, they also have to act. So that you get the pairing of the language, the acting, whatever the context that we've created for the play, all of those things after a few minutes start to come together and help us, create a lens for understanding what we're experiencing. So if you ever do feel a little uncomfortable, which I always do, I'm just going to say it like I'm not somebody who automatically walks in and is like, oh, good, Hamlet, let me listen to that, right? It's just not. I'm not right away until I start to feel my way through the experience that's being provided. So it's never just, the language is dominant, so don't hear me not saying that, but it just takes a minute for me to relax into it,
I mean, Hamlet's a good example of a play Shakespeare kept rewriting. There are 3 different versions of Hamlet, if not more, so he had the same problems.
The version without the to be or not to be speech.
Yeah,
right?
These works were living art. They were not frozen in stone when they were being created.
And I think that's our chief. I would just say that if I was to identify, that's our chief problem is that we tend to do that. And we do that here more than they do that in England. Like, Americans really are like, no, it has to be a certain way. Because we've really built that in, right? For us to experience it. Yeah. That's what we've been taught. But you go to England and they're like, no, we just didn't do the third act.
And just in terms of the rest of the world, I was thinking about this when you referenced working on a bilingual piece that, in the English-speaking world, it feels as though we actually have a harder relationship with Shakespeare than the rest of the world, right? Like you look at other countries that don't predominantly speak English, but have a strong tradition of producing Shakespeare. Germany, for instance, where the standard is if you're producing Shakespeare, you translate it for that moment in time. And so they are approaching Shakespeare in their own language, whereas for us, Shakespeare doesn't speak the same English we speak. And so it is a different language. And so we put ourselves in a bit of a disadvantage that way. But I not to be feedback, but I certainly also am like, the language is the thing that makes it so marvelous. So I struggle.
Yeah, I hear you.
It's back to holding the complexity.
Exactly.
You have to hold all of these complexities, and I think there's just no one dominant, rule here to go by because he's not here to tell us. So.
And on that point, I'm going to release you. Please use the restroom, get a refreshment, but also then please make your way to the theater because I think you will enjoy yourselves greatly. Starting in a few minutes. Yes. So, thank you all so very much. Thank you all so much.